Our sermon passage today is found in the first book of Genesis. I'm going to be reading all of chapter 5. Please turn there and follow along with me as I read. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 to 32. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, "Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands." Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Well, thank you, Amy. Well, this should be fun. Some of you, if you're visiting with us, you just popped in this morning. You're thinking, so that's what we're preaching on this morning. Like that's the sermon passage. And let me assure you, like we didn't just randomly, as pastors, elders, gather together and think, just hey, what about that one? Of all the chapters in the Bible. Instead, if you're new with us, we've been making our way through Genesis. We're in a sermon series in the book of Genesis, just taking it bit by bit. And Jared last week finished chapter 4, and so this morning we're in chapter 5 in this beautiful genealogy. And so I want to start off by asking this question, and I need you to be completely honest with me, like show of hands honest. How many of you in your daily Bible reading have ever skipped this chapter? Come on. Like, I have, like multiple times. I vividly remember the first time ever reading through the Bible in a year, and being in college, coming to this specific passage of Scripture and seeing all these names that I can't pronounce and thinking that doesn't seem like it's very relevant to my life. Let's just flip on to chapter 6. And so that's what I did. And I may have done that a time or two after that occasion as well. But let's be honest, many times this is how we treat in Genesis chapter 5 and just genealogies in general. And specifically this genealogy here in chapter 5, it's kind of like it's God's way of fast forwarding the narrative, right? That's how we can approach these genealogies. We have Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, so that's Genesis 2 through 4, finished with Abel, but God's got to get to Noah. And so how's he going to go from Abel to Noah? So let's fast forward it real quick by just inserting a quick genealogy. And so we treat these genealogies as kind of filler. It's kind of just filler in order to get from point A to point B. The reality, though, is nothing could be further than the truth. That genealogies in general and this genealogy is anything but filler. It's anything but like God's way of fast forwarding from this generation to that generation. Instead, like biblically speaking, genealogies are like really, really, really super important. And they're especially important here in the book of Genesis. Like I mentioned this before, but this word Genesis, it means origins. It means beginnings. It's where we get the word genealogy from. And so the entire book of Genesis is structured around genealogies. Like 10 times in this book, we read the phrase, these are the generations of so-and-so. So these are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of Isaac. These are the generations of Esau, and on and on and on and on. Which then begs the question, why? Like, why are all of these genealogies here in the book of Genesis? Like, what's the point? What's the purpose of all of these genealogies in the book of Genesis? Or more specifically, what's the point and what's the purpose of this specific genealogy here in Genesis chapter 5? Like, what's the point? What's the purpose? Why is this genealogy here? Is it just here for filler? Is it just here for fast forwarding from this generation to this generation? If not, then why in the world is this genealogy here? And not only that, but how in the world then is this genealogy relevant for our lives today? I mean, I don't know about you, but like these people, they not only lived a long, long time, which they did, but they lived a long, long, long time ago. And there's a whole lot of like funky names here. And so like, what in the world, of all the things going on in the lives of those who are in this room this morning, how in the world is a genealogy from a bunch of people a long time ago with names we cannot even pronounce other than Amy Phillips, who pronounced them extremely well. But aren't you glad I didn't email you this week and say, hey, can you read this passage for us this morning? But how's it relevant for us? And so then those are the two questions I want us to come to Genesis 5 with in this genealogy here this morning. Number one, what's the point of it? What's the purpose of it? Why in the world is it here? And number two, how's it relevant for our lives today? So question number one, and we're going to spend the majority of our time on question number one, but what's the point? What's the purpose? Why is this genealogy here? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to first understand the context in which this genealogy is found. In other words, this is really important. This genealogy didn't just like drop out of the sky. Instead, this genealogy, it was written in a specific context. And so then in order to understand this genealogy here in chapter 5, we have to remember the context and what's going on in Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 4. And specifically, we don't just need to understand the context of the chapters that preceded it. We have to understand the problem that's going on within those chapters. Because the problem that we're going to see and be reminded of that's going on in Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 4, it helps set up the genealogy here in Genesis chapter 5. And so then here's the problem that sets up Genesis chapter 5 and that the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 is speaking into. The problem is fourfold, and you can see it on your handout there. First, if you remember going back to Genesis chapter 3, mankind has been banished from the garden. That's problem number one. Adam and Eve, you remember, they rebelled against God, they sinned against God, therefore they were exiled out of, they were banished from the presence of God, the blessing of God, the God's rest in the garden. And so then now they live outside the garden, under God's curse, facing the consequences of their sin, facing the consequences of their rebellion against God in a fallen and broken world. And since that's true then, one of the consequences they face then is problem number 2. And problem number 2 then is this. It's that the offspring of the serpent is in conflict with or is at war against the offspring of the woman. That's problem number 2. And if you remember this, Jared talked about this last week in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. He talked about the importance of how Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 is really the foundational verse for the rest of the Bible and sets up the entire rest of the Bible. That if you remember that as a result of man's sin, the offspring of the serpent now is going to wage war against the offspring of Eve, the offspring of the woman. So that's problem number 2. The third problem then is this. It's that the ground outside the garden is cursed. This is problem number 3. And if you remember this, what we saw in Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 through 19, that as a result of man's sin and woman's sin, the ground is cursed. As a result, you got all these thorns and thistles. You have work now is painful. Work is hard. The ground is cursed. We live in a fallen, broken world now. That's problem number 3. Problem number 4 then is that outside the garden then, death now is the consequence of sin. Death is the consequence of sin. We first saw this, if you remember, in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. God said, if you eat of that tree, you will surely die. Then we saw it again in chapter 3, verse 19. God said that we're going to return back to the dust. Dust going to return back to the dust. So death now is the consequence for sin. So this is really important, sets up this genealogy. Those 4 problems, there's more problems than just those 4, but those fourfold problem that sets up now our genealogy here in chapter 5. However, if you remember, in the midst of these problems, in the midst of this curse, and in the midst of these consequences for sin, and this fourfold problem we just looked at, if you remember, God makes a promise. And the promise that God makes in the midst of these problems is that one day that the woman is going to have an offspring that's going to come and crush the head of the serpent, going to reverse the curse, going to restore mankind back into God's presence and God's rest in the garden, and restore everything back to its original condition and the way everything was meant to be. Like that's the promise God makes in the midst of this fourfold problem and the curse and the fallen, broken world in which Adam and Eve, in which we find ourselves. And so then you can imagine then, right? Like you can imagine the question then that everyone is wondering at the very end of Genesis chapter 3 and the rest of the book of Genesis. Everybody is wondering, is that him? Is that the offspring that God promised who is going to come? The seed of the woman who's going to crush the head of the serpent, reverse the curse, restore us back into God's presence? Like, is that him? Is that the promised offspring? And so then you can imagine what's going on in the minds of the readers at this point when they turn over to, and they didn't have Bibles and chapters and verses, but when they turn over to Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, and they read these words, "Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain." And when they would have read that, they're thinking, is this him? Is it Cain? Is Cain the one? Is he the offspring of the woman that was promised in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15? But as we saw the last couple weeks, as we keep reading in the rest of chapter 4, we learn pretty quick, don't we? It's not Cain. We see pretty quickly Cain's not the offspring of the woman that God promised. He's the offspring of the woman, yes, biologically, but based upon the choices that he makes, he's not the offspring of the promise. Instead, he's the offspring of the serpent. And we see that in the fact that Cain murders his brother Abel. Cain lets sin rule over him, just as the serpent ruled over Adam and Eve in the garden. And then from Cain, we see this downward spiral all throughout chapter 4 in the rest of Cain's family line, culminating in this guy by the name of Lamech, who in verses 23 and 24 in Genesis chapter 4 is this arrogant, boastful, murderous, adulterous, polygamist. And so we learn pretty quick by the time we get through Genesis chapter 4 that Cain and his family tree, they're sure not the offspring of the promise that God promised in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Like they're the offspring of the serpent. And so then at this point, like things look pretty bleak, don't they? Like you wonder at this point, like, is there any hope? You wonder, is God going to fulfill his promise? Or is the offspring of the serpent going to rule? Is the offspring of the serpent now going to reign? Are we just going to live outside the garden under this curse in this fallen, broken world like forever? But when we get to the last two verses of the end of chapter 4, that Jared mentioned last week, we see this glimmer of hope. We see this glimmer of hope, and the glimmer of hope is found in the fact that Adam and Eve, guess what? They have another son. And the name of their other son is Seth. And Seth has a son by the name of Enosh. And at that point in time, the very last verse in Genesis chapter 4 says that they begin to call on the name of the Lord. Which by the time you get to the end of chapter 4, then you begin to be eager in anticipation. Like your hopes were dashed with the family line of Cain, but now we have Seth and Enosh, and now our hopes are restored. And we're like, oh, is this it? Is this the offspring of the promise? Is this the one that God promised that was going to come? It wasn't Cain and his family line, but maybe it's Seth. Maybe it's Seth's line. And the offspring's going to come from him. That right there, and this is really important, that right there, those questions right there are the burning questions in our minds, or that should be in our minds when we come to Genesis chapter 5 and read this genealogy and read these words in Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. Look at verse 1 with me. It says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." Then in verse 3, we see that this genealogy of Adam goes through the line of his son Seth. And it traces then 10 different generations from Adam to Noah through the line of Seth. And you probably noticed this as Amy was reading. There's this, in this genealogy in chapter 5, there's this pattern. Do you notice this pattern? There's this pattern that's repeated over and over and over again in each of the 10 generations. And it's really important to understand this pattern. And so you can't understand this genealogy unless you understand this pattern. And so I'm not going to reread this entire genealogy again, but I want you to see a few examples of this pattern. And so let's start in verse 6. Verse 6 says, and see if you can trace this pattern. Verse 6 says, when Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Verse 9, same pattern. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905, and he died. Verse 12, same pattern. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 901 years, and he died. You see that pattern? That same pattern continues from Mahalalel, where we left off, all the way down to Noah in verse 32. And it's important. Did you notice the pattern? Like it has 6 parts, right? 6 parts. Number 1, it begins with how old the man was when he fathered his son. Number 2, then it gives the name of the son that he fathered. Number 3, then it tells how long he lived after he fathered his son. Number 4, then it tells us that he had more sons and daughters. Number 5, it gives the total number of years then that the father lived. And then number 6, it tells us that he died. And that same pattern, again, is repeated over and over and over again, 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Like it's like cut and paste 10 different times, just with different names and different numbers each time. You might have noticed, though, that there are a few exceptions to the pattern. There's a few disruptions. There's a few interruptions to this pattern. And it's really important to understand and to notice those interruptions, those disruptions. And the reason that it's important to notice them is because anytime the pattern is interrupted or disrupted in a genealogy, especially this genealogy, then something really important is going on. Like Moses doesn't just interrupt the pattern to interrupt the pattern. Instead, he interrupts the pattern to drop some clues. He interrupts the pattern to drop some hints. And the hints and the clues that he drops give us a clue as to whether or not the line of Seth is the line from which the promised offspring comes that God promised in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. The interruptions give us some clues. They give some hints as to whether or not the line of Seth is the line of the promise. And we see the first clue or the first hint in this first interruption of the genealogy in verses 1 through 5 here. Look at verse 1 with me again. This is the first interruption, the first clue, the first hint regarding whether or not this is the line of Seth is the line of promise. Verse 1 says, this is the book or the scroll of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. And he blessed them. And he named them man when they were created. And so then, you read those first 3 verses and you're like, I think I've heard that before. And I'm like, you have. Like we have heard that before. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 38. Or through 28, excuse me. Genesis 1, 26 through 28. But this makes sense, right? What is happening here at the very beginning here? This is the genealogy, the generations of Adam. And so Moses here is beginning by explaining where Adam came from. That Adam came from God. That God created Adam. But it's important to notice this. God didn't just create Adam. God created Adam in the likeness of God. Like that word likeness here is really, really important. And the reason it's important is because this word likeness, it conveys the idea of sonship. It's that Adam is the son of God. In other words, just like sons are born in the likeness of their father, so Adam was created in the likeness of his father, God, which again signifies that Adam is God's son. In verse 3 then, we see that God's son Adam has a son of his own. Look there with me at verse 3. It says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, there it is, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And so then we see an exception now to the pattern in these verses, right? That instead of saying that Adam fathered Seth, that's what all the other generations say, that so-and-so fathered so-and-so. But here, instead of saying that Adam fathered Seth, which is the normal pattern, verse 3 says that Adam fathered, and here's the interruption or the disruption, the break in the pattern. Adam fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. Why is there this disruption in the pattern? Because Moses wants to highlight something. He wants to communicate something to us. He wants us to see something here. And what he wants us to see here is this whole idea, again, of likeness. Of likeness, that just as Adam was created in the likeness of God, signifying that he's God's son, so Seth is born in the likeness and image of Adam, signifying that he's Adam's son. And this is really important. And the reason this is important is because this is in stark contrast to how the birth of Cain is described in chapter 4, verse 1. Look there with me real quick. In chapter 4, verse 1. When Cain was born, the text doesn't say anything about Cain being born in the image and likeness of Adam and Cain being Adam's son. Instead, all that it says is that Eve conceived and bore Cain. That's all it says. And why is that important? Why is that contrast, being able to see that important? It's important because this highlights the fact that whereas Cain is Adam and Eve's biological son, Seth is Adam and Eve's promised son. He's the son through which the line of the promise would continue and the promised offspring would come. And so then that's the first hint, that's the first clue we're given when it comes to whether or not the line of Seth is the line of the promise. That Seth was born in the image and likeness of Adam, therefore was Adam's son, while Cain was simply Adam and Eve's biological son. The second hint then that we're given is found in the second interruption to the pattern, and we see that in verse 21. Look at verse 21 with me. Verse 21 says, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So again, the pattern's interrupted. And we see the pattern being interrupted in two ways. First, 2 times in these verses, it tells us that Enoch walked with God. Like that doesn't fit the pattern in all the other generations. The second way that the pattern is interrupted, though, is that Enoch didn't die. Like everyone else in this genealogy, including Noah, eventually in chapter 9, ends the same way. And he died, 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 and he died. Over and over again. But when we get to Enoch, it doesn't say that Enoch died. Instead, it just simply says he was not. Why? for God took him. Meaning he didn't die. I don't know what this would have looked like. I can't explain it. It just means God grabbed him. He took him. I don't know if his clothes were left. I don't know. He didn't die. He took him. But it breaks the pattern. And so what's Moses communicating here with these breaking of the pattern here? What he's doing is this. He's contrasting the seventh generation in Seth's line here in chapter 5, which is Enoch, with the seventh generation in Cain's line, which is Lamech. Like if you remember, we talk about this a lot, but the number 7 is really, really big in that day. Like it's the number of completion, it's the number of fullness. And so the seventh person in a genealogy is really an important key figure in the genealogy. That seventh person kind of sums up, he kind of represents the whole family line as a whole. And so then in the seventh generation of Cain's line, you have a boastful, arrogant, murder, polygamist by the name of Lamech. While in which then characterizes and summarizes and represents what Cain's line is all about. While in the seventh generation of Seth's line, you have a man who walked with God and didn't die and was just taken up by the name of Enoch. Which again gives us another hint, gives us another clue when it comes to the question about whether or not the line of Seth is the line of the promise. The third hint then that is given is found in the third interruption of this genealogy and the pattern in this genealogy. And we see this in verse 28. Look at verse 28 with me. Verse 28 says, when Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And so again, we have an interruption, right? We have a disruption to the pattern here. And the way it's interrupted this time is by a promise. That Lamech promises that a son by the name of Noah is going to be born, and when he's born, he's going to bring relief and rest to the ground that's been cursed. And when you hear that, you should be thinking, Lamech? That name sounds familiar. Like I've heard that name before. Yeah, you have. Genesis chapter 4. The name Lamech is found again in Cain's line. But the Lamech in chapter 4 in Cain's line is a different Lamech from the Lamech in chapter 5 in Seth's line. But there's a contrast here. This interruption, this disruption of the pattern is to reveal and highlight this contrast here. And the contrast is seen in this, is that the Lamech in Cain's line and the Lamech in Seth's line, they both speak. They both have something to say. Nobody else in any of these genealogies are saying anything except for Lamech in both of these genealogies. But what they have to say is vastly different. The Lamech in Cain's line, what he has to say is just, he just boasts about killing a man. He's just arrogant and boastful about killing a man. While the Lamech in Seth's line, what he has to say is about a promise. Not about how he's going to kill somebody, but a promise about how his son Noah is going to bring rest and relief from the curse of the ground. And if you have an ESV Bible, which I'm preaching from, you might notice that there's a little footnote in verse 29 by the word relief. And if you trace that footnote down at the very bottom of the page, it says that the name Noah sounds like the Hebrew word for rest. And the reason that the word Noah sounds like the Hebrew word for rest is because that's what Noah's going to do. He's going to come and bring rest. He's going to come and bring relief from the curse to the ground and all the painful toil and heartache that comes from the ground and the broken world and fallen world in which we live. So then, put all that together. 3 hints, 3 clues, and these 3 exceptions when it comes to the question of whether or not Seth's line is the line of the promise. And when you put these 3 hints and these clues together, and then as you understand the context and the problem, the promise, and the question that this genealogy is answering, then the point of this genealogy becomes really, really clear. And the point of this genealogy then is this, is that this genealogy is here because this genealogy of Seth here in chapter 5 is being contrasted with the genealogy of Cain in chapter 4. And it's giving all of these hints and all these clues to show that the promised offspring of the woman from Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, it's not coming through the line of Seth or coming through the line of Cain, it's coming through the line of Seth. That the line of Cain is the offspring of the serpent, which leads to murder, which leads to sin, which leads to death, while the line of Seth is the offspring of the promised one who's going to come and crush the serpent, reverse the curse, and restore us back into God's presence and God's rest in the garden. Like that's the point of this random genealogy. Which then begs the question though, even in knowing that, the question still remains, who is it? Because everyone in this genealogy in chapter 5 dies, except for Enoch. But everybody that dies after him. So if the promised offspring isn't one of these 10 guys in this genealogy, again, who is it? And so we keep reading. Chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, we're not going to read it all this morning. Right, and we come along all these names. Abraham, is it him? Isaac, is it him? Jacob, is it him? Joseph, is it him? And we wonder, is it one of them? You're like, after you finish all 50 chapters, you're like, nope, not all of them, that they die. And so we keep reading in the Old Testament, and we read Moses and Samuel and David and Elijah and Daniel and a whole host of other people. Is it them? Is it them? Is it them? Is this the one? Nope. They all die too. So it's not any of them. So then we keep reading in the New Testament. Matthew and Mark, and then we get into Luke, and we get 3 chapters into Luke, and we come to another genealogy. And this time, this is the genealogy of Jesus. So then, turn there with me real quick, all the way to Luke. I know that's a heavy turn, but Luke chapter 3. Like, you got to see this. This is the genealogy. This is the family line of Jesus. Like, it just blows my mind. You're not going to believe this. Luke chapter 3. Some of you are thinking, oh, no, not another genealogy. Yeah, another genealogy. Luke chapter 3, verse 23 says, this is Jesus' genealogy, starting with him. Jesus, when he began his ministry, and if you thought the names in Genesis 5 were easy, they got nothing on these. Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Methat, the son of Levi, the son of Melchi, the son of Jenai, the son of Joseph, the son of Mattathias, the son of Amos, the son of Nahum, the son of Esli, the son of Negai, the son of Math, the son of Mattathias, the son of Simeon, the son of Joseph, the son of Joda. And the genealogy, it continues, right? For 50 more generations until we read this in the very middle of verse 36. Pay attention to these names. Look at verse 36. We've seen these names before. The son of Shem, the son of Noah. This should sound familiar. The son of Lamech, the son of Methuselah, the son of Enoch, the son of Jared, the son of Methuselah, the son of Canaan, which is Kenan, the son of Enos, which is Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. Like, anybody else recognize any of these names? Like, these are the same exact names that we just saw in Genesis chapter 5. Like, Genesis 5 ends with Noah fathering Shem, but Seth's family line doesn't stop there. Instead, it continues for over 70 more generations until we get to the one that God promised in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, Jesus. Like, he's the one that God promised. He's the offspring. He's the seed of the woman that was promised, who was going to come and crush the serpent, reverse the curse, and restore us back into God's presence and God's rest in the garden. And that's exactly what he did. If you continue to read in the book of Luke, that's exactly what he did in his death and his resurrection. That on the cross, Jesus took the curse. He took the death we deserve for our sin. But he didn't stay dead. Instead, 3 days later, he rose back to life. He conquered death. He crushed the head of the serpent. Like, don't miss this, that in this genealogy in Genesis chapter 5, like, Jesus is the one who's the true and better Adam, who resisted the serpent's temptation and succeeded where Adam failed. He's the true and better Enoch, who not only walked with God in this life, but who defeated death and conquered death and walked with God through death. He's the true and better Noah, who not only brought rest and relief from the curse of the ground, but who also brought rest and relief from the waters of God's judgment that we deserve for our sin. Like, this right here is the ultimate point of this genealogy here and why it's relevant for us today, which then leads to question number 2. That this genealogy is relevant to us today because it points to Jesus. It points to Jesus. It leads us to Jesus. And the reality of that then has massive implications for every single person in this room this morning. Like, first, if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, then here's how this genealogy is relevant for you. It's relevant in this way. Whether you accept this or even can comprehend this and understand this at all, here's how it's relevant for you. There are only 2 family lines. There's just 2. Like, we all came from Adam and Eve, and then from there, all of humanity is broken up into 2 family lines. You're either in the family line of Cain and Lamech and the offspring of the serpent in Genesis chapter 4, or you're in the line of Seth and Enoch and Noah and Jesus in Genesis chapter 5. There's just those 2. But here's the kicker. We've all been born into the line of Cain. In other words, we're all born with this proud, murderous, polygamist, adulterous, arrogant sin nature that Cain possessed, that Lamech possessed. Like, we're all born that way. But the good news of this genealogy is you don't have to stay there. Like, you can change your family tree. You can change your genealogical record. But the only way that can be changed is Jesus. By believing and trusting that Jesus is the promised offspring that God promised in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And believing that his death on the cross and his resurrection reversed the curse, crushed the serpent, restored us back into God's presence and God's rest in the garden. Like you can belong to the line of the promise if you trust and place your faith in Jesus today. But secondly, this passage and this genealogy is relevant for those of us here this morning that are Christians. And it's relevant in at least two ways, not just these two ways, but at least these two ways, and we'll end with this. First, this genealogy is confirmation 8,376 that God is faithful. I just came up with that number. But that God is faithful and that God always keeps his promises. Like always. Like there are people here this morning going through all sorts of stuff, just questioning, wondering, reading promises in the Bible. And you look at your life, you read this promise, you look at your life, you see this promise, you look at your circumstance, you see this promise, and you're like, I see this, I feel this, I'm experiencing this. Is that promise true? Yeah, it's true. Just look at Genesis chapter 5, Luke chapter 3. God is a promise keeper. He cannot not keep his promise. Genesis chapter 5 reminds us that God keeps his promises, so trust him. Trust his promises. Then secondly, the way that it's relevant is this. Just try and wrap your mind around this. This genealogy, if you're a Christian here this morning, this genealogy here in Genesis chapter 5, this is your genealogy. This is your genealogy. Like, I don't know what family you came from. When you look back at mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and everybody after that, I don't know what kind of family tree you came from, how dysfunctional it was, how hard it was, how painful it was, how good it was, how joyous it was, or anything else. But if you're a Christian here this morning, then this is your new family line. This genealogy is your genealogy. And it's not your family line, it's not your genealogy because you deserved it. Not because you deserve to be in it. Instead, it's your genealogy because you were adopted into it through Christ. And because you were adopted into it through Christ, then all the promises and all the inheritance and all the blessings that come with being his offspring and a member of his family tree, they're all yours. Like all of them. The removal of the curse and the removal of all the implications of the curse. Rest for your soul. Restoration back into God's presence. Fellowship, unhindered fellowship with God. Complete and total forgiveness of sin. All of those are yours now because you belong to Jesus' family tree if you're a Christian. This genealogy is more than just filler. This genealogy is more than just Moses' fast-forwarding technique to get from Abel to get to Noah. Instead, this genealogy is relevant for all of our lives because this genealogy ultimately points us and leads us to the person of Jesus, the one that we all ultimately need. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for your word. Thank you for how even in the midst of seemingly unimportant filler space in the Bible, Lord, that you and your word is there for a reason. It's there for a purpose. Every word, every dot, all of it. And Lord, it all ultimately points to our need for a Savior and our need for Jesus. Lord, thank you for how through this genealogy you remind us of your character and your faithfulness. Lord, even to this day, Lord, it's true that the promised offspring has come. He's inaugurated his kingdom. He has taken the curse upon himself in our place. By the Spirit, you have come and indwelt us, your presence inside of us. We have rest for our souls in Christ. But Lord, at the same time, we live in a fallen, broken world, and we experience and feel the curse all around us. And so, Lord, at the same time, we're longing, we're waiting for the ultimate culmination, ultimate consummation and fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. The day in which Jesus returns back to this earth, eradicates all the effects of sin, reverses the curse finally and completely, fully, and makes all things new. And we live in a new city garden here on this earth with you in your presence, unhindered, fully and finally at rest, enjoying, worshiping, satisfied completely together in you. Why? Because of Christ, and because we're grafted and adopted into his genealogy, into his family tree. And so, God, I pray that that would be true of those here this morning who haven't trusted you, that they would trust in you this morning. And those who have, that we would relish our new identity of who we are and cause us to be glad and rejoice and worship Christ and boast in him alone, remembering who we are and all the blessings and all the promises that come with being a blessed son and daughter of the promise of the offspring. We thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen.